Would you like to be able to improve your communication in your relationship or when you're going out dating? Today, we're going to be talking about communication, so stay tuned for today's podcast and press subscribe right now so you don't miss any episode. If you'd like to find out more about how to improve your relationships, head over to therelationshipmaze.com, where we have lots of information and resources to help you improve your relationships. Or if you'd like to find out more about the podcast, head over to therelationshipmazepodcast.com, where we have more information about our podcast and extra notes about this episode. Welcome to the Relationship Maze podcast. And today we're talking about communication.
Yes, so communication is always hailed as the number one focus to sort out your relationship. So ask anyone about what's going to improve your relationship and they will tell you it's communication. But what do we actually mean by that when we talk about communication? So today we're going to be looking at how best to communicate, how not to communicate, and what to communicate about. But before we start talking about communication, and I mean verbal communication, I think it's really important to emphasize that communication is not only about words. So there are many, many different ways in which we communicate. We communicate through our body language, by looking at our partner longingly, for example, or with anger. We communicate, for example, by rolling our eyes, indicating that we're not happy about something that's being said. We communicate through touch, by stroking or hugging our partner. So there are many, many different ways in which we communicate. Just to be really clear about this, communication is not just about talking.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, when you said about how sometimes we might communicate sort of longingly, or we might communicate in sort of disdain or whatever the words.
Contempt.
Yeah. Well, and to one person, giving a look of longingness might be interpreted as the opposite by the other person, because it's not just what we think we're communicating, it's also how we interpret it. And one important principle here, I think, is thinking about that there is no communication.
Yes, we communicate all the time.
Everything. Yeah. And this is the thing, it's like, I've known people that said, well, I'm really angry with this person, so I'm just not going to communicate with them. I'm just going to sit in a room and not talk. And in fact, that's a more powerful communication than saying something.
Yes.
You go into a room with somebody that you know and maybe had a disagreement, and you sit down and just cross your arms and think, well, not going to communicate with them.
Yeah, the classic sulking, isn't it? Yeah. Passive-aggressive sulking, but not saying anything, but indicating to your partner that you're really angry. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. So everything that we do is a communication, even not communicating. I mean, think right now, think of a friend who you haven't been in touch with for a while, or a friend that you've spent quite a lot of time in the past communicating with and making arrangements with. But they don't get in touch with you much, or they haven't been in touch with you, and you thought, well, I always make the effort, so I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to wait for them to make the effort. And then what happens when they don't communicate with you? What do you say to yourself? I mean, you had that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really frustrating, and I come up with all sorts of interpretations, but in the end, it doesn't really change anything, does it? I can get sulky about it, but it's a lot more effective to just go and check with a friend, well, what's going on? Well, we haven't heard for a while. Would you like to meet up, or are you busy? I mean, it's just finding out why there hasn't been any contact for a while. That's way more effective.
Yeah, and ultimately, people are different. They may not communicate with you, not because they don't care about you, but because some people get very wrapped up in what they're doing. Maybe they're under a lot of stress, or maybe their personality type is very different.
Yeah,
like you go and see the same film together and you come out and one of you thinks, that was an amazing film, and the other thinks, well, that was really boring.
Yeah.
Why is it that with somebody you think you get on really well with, you have a very different experience? And it comes down to how we filter the world, our personality preferences, as you might say, as you might call them.
Yeah, and I think we should pick up on that another time. Just that would be really important to talk about. But just sort of coming back to communication and just sort of starting this conversation by saying that it's important to that communication takes place all the time, so it's not just verbal communication. But I think what I wanted to add here also is that it's not necessarily always about relationships are not necessarily strong because you talk a lot. Sometimes you might talk a lot and still have difficulties. It's also sometimes about doing something together, having some fun together, having joyful experiences together. So talking is not always the number one way of resolving conflict. But of course, it's a really, really important tool that we have because, well, for all the reasons that we're going to talk about today, why is it important? So let's start with the how. How do we communicate? So what's the best way of talking to your partner? It's really important, particularly when it comes to more challenging conversations, when often there is silence or an avoidance of the communication, that it's actually important to address the issues that need to be talked about when there's something that you're not happy about. So that it's important to kind of sit down and have a conversation about it, or regularly to sit down and have conversations about anything really. And there's certain rules that need to be established. So particularly when it comes to more to talks or conversations which are related to conflictual topics. So one of the rules might be that you have to set aside some time to have this conversation and to establish with your partner whether this is the right time to talk about something that might be a little bit more challenging for them. So, for example, if your partner is in the middle of doing something, they're still busy on the computer because they've got to fire off another email, that might not be the best time to ask your partner to have a conversation about something that you find very frustrating. You're not going to have their attention. So that would be one rule. Another rule might be that you decide to just talk about one thing at the time and not a whole host of frustrations that you have. So if you want to talk about your partner being late all the time after work and you're waiting there with your dinner, you've cooked it and partner's still not at home, then talk about that, but don't talk about all sorts of other frustrations that you have at the same time. It gets too overwhelming and it doesn't actually then address the one issue that you need to address. Do you want to come in with another rule, or shall I?
No, you go on.
Shall I keep going? Okay. So another rule, talking about the idea of picking up just one thing, is also just pick up the one thing and don't talk about other complaints that you have from the past. The sort of conversations which sometimes go down the lines of you always do this or you never do that. That's not helpful. Stick with the present, stick with now, and stick with the one thing that you want to address.
And also, another thing that I'd like to add to that is how you express it as well. Yeah. So don't express it with blame. Mm-hmm. So it's a great way to start that conversation is to say, I feel X. Yeah. So not like I feel that you're a really annoying person, because that's still blaming, but I feel upset about how we communicated the other day, and I'd like to look at some ways we can resolve that. Mm-hmm. So I felt stressed or I felt overwhelmed when you were telling me about X, mm-hmm. and let's explore some ways that we can kind of resolve that, kind of work this out better in the future. Mm-hmm. So it's really important, first of all, to express how you're feeling, how it made you feel, because if we're saying something that could be challenging to the other person, it's very natural that they may become defensive if we put it in the wrong way. If we put it in a way that it feels like we're blaming, mm-hmm. even when the person knows that maybe they have some responsibility about that, whenever we feel blamed, we instantly put up these defenses. And when we're defensive, we may get more emotional, we may kind of deny things, we may kind of, in our non-verbal communication, even if we appear to be giving away a positive response, we might seem to be like we're not really kind of on track with that. And that's because we're feeling defensive. Absolutely. So starting with, I feel X. So if somebody that you care about says, I felt really upset when we had this conversation, what do we want to do? Well, if we know that somebody you care about feels upset, we want to listen. We want to kind of see if there's something we can do to help with that emotional response. Whereas if I had started with, you mustn't keep shouting at me, you mustn't do X, Y, or Z, well, immediately it's like, what was I doing? Or was I doing that?
The shutters
come down. Mm. So starting with kind of opening about your feelings can be really important.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so we talked about right time, right conversation, feeling statements, taking responsibility for what you want to bring and the impact something is having on you, so that your partner can understand that. Also the right place, so it's not a good idea maybe to have this discussion in the middle of the kitchen when there are kids around, other people listening, or in a coffee shop where other people can listen in, just to make sure that you actually have the space where you can have this conversation which might be experienced as a bit more challenging.
And actually, along with that, I'd suggest that actually sometimes doing some activity at the same time can also be useful. So if you're going out for a walk where you're basically, you're kind of doing something else, but you're kind of physically in a different environment, sometimes that can be a good place for a difficult conversation, rather than saying, well, let's go into this room, let's go to this place, and that place becomes associated with almost like the naughty step when you're a kid.
Absolutely.
So every time your partner says, well, let's just meet here, and you instantly know, oh, what have I done now? So that sort of thing.
That's true.
Yeah, and it's the same with kids actually, that if you've got teenage children, and you want to kind of talk to them about something, and with teenagers, they often might not talk to you. If your teenager or if your child will kind of do something with you still, like go bowling or whatever it happens to be, sometimes those are the times where they actually will talk. So where they're engaged in some other activity, or you're kind of traveling somewhere, those can be times when actually people are okay talking about things where often they clam up. So finding a location where it might not be the usual environment can be quite a good thing.
Yeah, particularly if you're not sort of sitting opposite each other, which can be experienced as confrontation. Or if you're walking side by side, you're not looking at each other, that might be easier. You might feel less defensive when having this conversation. So that's absolutely true. Good point. Sometimes in the car, these conversations can be helpful as well. If you don't have to concentrate too much on the road, but just to have a sort of gentle conversation about it can be helpful.
Yeah, but also in the car, just be really aware that if it likely is to get emotional, don't let it in the car, because when you're in your car is basically a dangerous weapon. So if you're feeling angry,
I'll take that back. So
I said it first actually.
Till we take it with care. Absolutely. Good. So we talked a little bit about how to communicate. Some rules around that need to be established. Now, really importantly, what are the ways that you should not communicate? And therefore, that have been identified by John Gottman. So he's one of the leading marriage consultants, relationship consultants in the States. He came up with 4 ways of communication that are particularly undermining for relationships. And he called it the 4 horsemen of relationships, because they are the kind of ways that really undermine and destroy a relationship and lead you down the path of destruction. Well, the first one is criticism, and lots of people might say, well, what's wrong with criticism? I'm entitled to criticize my partner sometimes. Criticism is okay if it's a critique, so to speak, if it's not an attack, if it's any form of criticism, anything that's just perceived as an attack by your partner is not going to be responded to well. So if you have a legitimate complaint and you present it in a way that we've just discussed, that will be received very differently from your partner than criticism. Whereas criticism, constant criticism, is leading you down the path to further destruction in the relationship. It's experienced as nagging by the partner, and it's not actually resolving any issues in the relationship. So the second one that the second horseman that Gottman identified is contempt. And contempt is one of the leading factors usually that lead to divorce. So if there's a lot of contempt in the relationship, that's a very strong indicator that your relationship is actually on quite shaky grounds and needs some serious looking at. So contempt is this putting your partner down. It's often expressed, for example, through sarcasm in the relationship, through eye rolling. So as soon as your partner says something, you roll your eyes. That is a sort of an all-round attack on your partner, and communicating to the partner that they're not good enough, that they are, not worthy enough, something along those lines. So if there's a lot of contempt in the relationship, this relationship is in serious trouble and needs some looking at. The third horseman that Gottman identifies is defense, and we've already talked about defenses. Tom just mentioned them earlier on. So if you are being criticized by your partner, the first response is likely to be a defensive response. because nobody likes to be under attack. If you're under attack, you defend. And that's kind of quite normal. We all defend to different degrees all the time in our life. But if we are moving into this direction all the time where we constantly defend, we're not taking in anything anymore that our partner's bringing to the conversation, we are actually effectively stopping any effective communication in the relationship. So watch that as well. Notice when you're constantly saying but, yeah? So your partner says something, you come back with, well, but you always do this, you always do that. Then that creates this cycle where the partner then starts to blame more, and you kind of, you're on this merry-go-round of constant blame and attack, blame and defense. It's not actually taking you anywhere. So with defense, really what's to take away from here is just to be mindful that you also have responsibility sometimes in the relationship, and it's maintaining this kind of open stance. First of all, find out what the partner's got to say before you immediately jump in with a defense. And the final horseman identified by Godman is the sort of like an acceleration of defensiveness is stonewalling, where literally the shutters are completely down. And stonewalling is very often a response to contempt. So if you have a very contemptuous partner who puts you down all the time, you protect and defend yourself by just blocking off completely, by kind of completely withdrawing from the relationship, not engaging at all. And this might be literally that you are physically exiting the room. So your partner says, oh, you haven't done the dishes again today, and off you go. You're gone. You're not engaging with this kind of conversation anymore. So if this continues again and again and again, you're just literally not engaging at all with your partner, well, there can't be any communication. Nothing can be addressed anymore. So we might do another podcast on the 4 horsemen. They're really interesting. There's lots to unpack around these particular presentations. And they're certainly the kind of presentations I usually experience when I work with couples and couples therapy. So one of them, one or the other, will show up in troubled relationships. But back to, we talked about the how to communicate, the how not to communicate. Let's talk about what to communicate about, which is just equally important. And what have we got on our list? I'm just turning the page now. So the first thing to communicate about are our expectations that we have of our partner. What do we want from our partner? And there is it's a big bundle expectations that we need to unpack a little bit about. What do we mean by that?
Yeah, and expectations, I mean, there's 2 ways of seeing this, is that we have certain needs, we have certain wants when we are in a relationship. At the same time, we have certain expectations, and it's also examining, are our expectations in the first place, are they realistic, or are they unrealistic? Because if we have unrealistic expectations, then we're always going to feel unsatisfied. Yeah. And some people in relationships, a lot of people I meet feel unsatisfied. They feel their expectations aren't being met. And sometimes that's because they haven't communicated what they need, what they want. Sometimes it's because they're in the wrong relationship maybe, but sometimes it's because they have unrealistic expectations. So first of all, you need to know, what are your expectations? Are they realistic? With the person you're with, it's negotiating how you can meet their needs and their wants as well. So that there's communicating, what are some of these expectations in the first place.
And just being really clear about your underlying assumptions about relationships and about the other person. So if your assumption is that the weekend is always set aside for us as a couple, we have to spend time together as a couple. If your partner then goes off and plays football or goes to singing classes or whatever every weekend, you might feel a sense of disappointment. And you might feel like your partner's letting you down or you're not important enough in the relationship. But that's a huge assumption, isn't it? And that needs to be clarified. So any kind of expectation, any underlying assumption needs to be clarified so that you make sure that you're on the same page. And then you can negotiate around that. And your partner might communicate that it's really important for them that they do something on their own, for example, at the weekend and not spend the whole weekend together. That's okay as long as you come to some sort of agreement around this.
Yes, and it's finding some sort of agreement, and also, both people looking into that, because again, if you don't see your partner much in the week, and you do tend to spend time the weekends with them, and they're off playing football both days in the weekend, so you don't see them at all on the weekend, then you have to think, well, actually, maybe that's quite right that you don't feel that your partner really kind of cares about you enough, because they're not putting that time into you. We need to put time into the relationship. So, and when our lives are very busy, we want time for ourselves, we want time for a relationship, but there is that kind of, it is a balancing act.
Absolutely, and we've talked about attachment styles in previous podcasts. So depending on your attachment styles, you will have very different needs and very different underlying assumptions in connection with these needs. So so you might make different demands on your partner, and you have different ideas about relationships. So just, I think what we would like you really to take away as well from today's podcast is to don't assume that you know what your partner thinks or feels. You have to check. You never know. So just because something is really important to you, that doesn't mean that it's important to your partner. Be clear that you're on the same page about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes to negotiate what you want with them. Find the right time, find the right place to have that negotiation. And, it is important as well. And I see this with a lot of couples over time, is they don't make enough time to spend with each other. It's easy to think, well, and I think we talked about this in another podcast, is that your partner becomes just like something else in your environment that you see every day. It's like, it's not something different, not something special. It's about taking time to value your partner, taking time to talk. Yeah. Maybe spending an evening every week where you do go on a date, or taking certain amounts of time that you regularly do spend together, not forgetting to put that time in to your partner, no matter how stressful life might seem otherwise. If your relationship gets affected, that's going to be an additional stress. So making sure you take that time, focus on your communication is so important.
Yeah, so we talked about the sort of the what to communicate about. So we talked about expectations, we talked about underlying assumptions, etc. And another reason to sit down and have a conversation, or not sit down, but walk and have a conversation, find some time to talk about something, is to clarify these assumptions, being really clear. Is this what we both want? Is this the expectation? Or also to clarify, for example, when you feel very hurt or disappointed by something that your partner has done or said, that is a good thing to follow up on and to clarify with your partner. Was their intention to upset you? Or was there something that they didn't actually intend to do, but it just happened because you interpreted their behavior, their action, what they said in a particular way? So take the time also to clarify, is this what your intention was? Did you try to make me cry, or did you attempt to make me upset by saying something like this?
Yeah, and just with my perspective as well, is 9 times out of 10 or even more, the other person doesn't intend to make you upset, doesn't intend to make you cry. In fact, I think it's very rare that is the case. When someone says something that upsets us, is something triggers us as to a reaction, or maybe the other person is feeling defensive themselves. So they go on the attack a bit because they're feeling defensive about something, or something's triggered them into an emotional state that they can't deal with. So it's often that the other person's not able to communicate at that time in the way that they want. They do say something in a way that then comes across maybe as attacking, and it's trying to resolve that without thinking they're always trying to kind of hurt me.
Absolutely. So something that I often take as a starting point in couples therapy is to indicate to the couple that it's really important to start with the notion that you're ascribing noble intention to your partner, so that your partner always has the best intention. They're not there to they're not out to get you all the time. You might experience it as that, but that's not necessarily the intention by your partner. So just to start from a positive foundation is really helpful. So what to talk about: expectations, clarifications, and then of course it's really important to talk about frustrations, which is kind of the next level, isn't it? Is if your expectations are not met, if nothing has been quite clarified, or maybe there has been an attempt to clarify but it hasn't really resulted in something that you find satisfying, you might feel quite frustrated. And any kind of frustration that lingers and festers is really unhealthy, because it can kind of often accumulate, get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then there's this big eruption and often this big argument where everything kind of gets presented to the partner. So frustrations, if you are frustrated about something, try to address that as soon as possible, and follow the steps that we talked about early on about how to communicate, the sort of finding the time to present this to your partner, making sure you've got your partner's attention, and then communicating how you feel and why you feel so frustrated, so that your partner has an opportunity to respond to your frustration by clarifying from their side, for example, or explaining what happened in this particular situation that you found frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also being really clear about what it is that frustrates you, but being careful with the why, because I think the problem with why is that we then give reasons, and often the thing that we give reasons for, they're not the real reasons. We just come up with them thinking, well, this is why I felt this, or this is why X, Y, or Z. I think sometimes describing actually what was going on and how it affected you can be really important.
Absolutely. Good. So talking about expectation, clarification, frustrations, these are all things to talk about. But finally, also, it's really important, of course, to talk about the good stuff. So to affirm your love for your partner. So let them know that's something that needs to be communicated. Don't assume that your partner knows that you love them. I mean, they do know, probably fundamentally, but well, it depends on where you are and what stage in your relationship. But they also need to hear it. It's just nice to hear that from your partner, that you love them, that you care for them, that you like something that they're doing, something that they're saying, anything really. A compliment can go a long way in a relationship as well. Just so affirmations of love are just as important.
Yeah, and I'd actually say that a lot of people don't know their partner loves them.
No,
after a while, you're in a relationship for some time. If you stop saying I love you, if you stop doing nice things for them, stop complimenting them, they may feel that they're not loved.
Yeah, don't take it for granted. You can't take this for granted. And I'm actually, it's really interesting. I frequently work with clients who, tell me that they feel loved by their partner, etc. But they have never expressed it. They've never actually said to each other that they love each other, which I find quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's quite, there's a lot of fear attached for many people to express this, as if they make themselves very vulnerable when they say this. So, what have you got to lose? If you can't say this to your partner, then what's wrong in your relationship that you can't express that?
Well, it's also what is it in your own experience, in your history? If you grew up in a family where your parents never expressed feelings, or sometimes expressing feelings led to feeling bad about it, then you may find it difficult. Yeah. But if you go on and doing that, it can lead to a very unhealthy relationship. And I've seen this with people where relationships end, or a partner might have an affair because if they don't feel that they're loved by the other person, we all need love.
Yeah. And we need to feel it, and sometimes we also need to hear it. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And we may feel it through what we hear.
Yeah.
We may feel it through what we see, or may feel it through a sense of touch. We can explore that more on another podcast. So there's different ways that we express that, and we all have different ways of feeling that. So for some of you, it might be that just someone telling you "I love you" is what's needed. For somebody else, it might be kind of occasionally being bought flowers, or kind of seeing something, or the way you look at them. For somebody else, it's also not just saying "I love you," but the tone of voice, the way that you say it is important. And then for other people, it's the more physical side, so being touched or making love or whatever it might be. That also is an important part of feeling loved.
Yeah, that's the sort of love languages, isn't it, that you're talking about?
Yeah, and let's talk about that in
we'll
maybe
leave
the next
that for
podcast.
Another podcast and pick that up because it's really important.
Yeah.
Good. I think finally also what might be important to convey in terms of communication is just to sort of see any form of communication as a way of connection. So when you are talking about something that you might experience as conflictual, talking about it creates a connection. So even if you're angry and frustrated with your partner and having communication and communicating with your partner, that creates connection. I think I'd be much more concerned, and I'm usually much more concerned with with couples who have got to the stage where they're both completely stonewalled, where there is no more connection, where partners have actually withdrawn from the relationship because they've just simply given up. That's a very, very troubling sign of any kind of relationship. So as long as you're engaging, even if you are having sometimes a fight about something, that's all right. I mean, you will have fights, you will have disagreements. It's normal. Conflict is a healthy part of every relationship. As long as you're doing that, you are still seeking connection with your partner. That's what's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I prefer to relabel fights, because fight does tend to suggest there's a winner or a loser.
Yeah.
So I prefer to relabel them as, maybe kind of heated discussions, or kind of, it could be arguments. But again, we tend to think as a winner or loser. Whereas, when we're having these sort of discussions, when we're feeling, when we're having disagreements, it's about finding that discussion, finding that kind of way to work together, rather than one person wins, one person loses.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
good. Okay, I think we can leave it there.
Great, yeah. So hope you've taken away some things from this podcast. Again, please subscribe if you haven't already, so you can tune into every episode. We're going to cover some really interesting topics, as we have in the past. And if you want to find out more about how to improve your relationship, head over to therelationshipmaze.com. And for more information about this podcast and extra notes, head over to therelationshipmazepodcast.com.
That's our new website. And we look forward to being in touch with you again next week with our next topic. So take care until then.
Bye.
Bye.